Hi there, I'm Peter Wheelhauer from Western Michigan University. In this recording, I'm going to be talking about how to compare interval and ratio level dependent variables, and especially thinking about how to look at mean differences between those variables. This involves hypothesis testing, setting up our hypotheses and expectations, and then finding a way of measuring our variables in such a way that we can compare groups that we're interested in studying. From a previous presentation, I talked about generating hypotheses. And again, hypotheses are specific statements that we have about expectations regarding the relationships between variables. And the basic idea in developing a hypothesis is thinking about how you think an independent variable will be related to or will affect the dependent variable. Now, in this case, we're looking for a specific situation. In a previous talk, we looked at how to compare categorical dependent variables with categorical independent variables, and we used crosstabs. In this case, we're thinking about dependent variables that are continuous in nature, that is, at their interval or ratio level in their scale or in their level of measurement. And we can just kind of lump interval and ratio level variables into the broad category of continuous variables. By labeling them as continuous variables, it also enables us to include some ordinal level variables too. But for now, we're going to focus on an interval or ratio level variable and then compare that with a categorical independent variable. The method that we're going to use for assessing a hypothesis then is comparing the categories in an independent variable and looking at differences in means. So as a hypothetical example, we can look at the way that Democrats and Republicans feel about poor people. There are lots of different examples that we could use for different kinds of things, but this seems to be a fairly common concern that people have, a common set of thinking that people have about how the parties differ and about how people within the major political parties differ. So in this case, we might have a general idea that Democrats, on balance, will feel more positively about poor people than Republicans will. And we could come up with a theory that develops why this might be. It could be related to policies, it could be related to demographics, or any variety of things. But this is our basic idea. Well, as with all hypotheses, what we can do is we can try to set this up to make us to ensure that we're starting to think quantitatively about the concepts we have in mind, so that we're moving more away from just describing how Democrats and Republicans feel about poor people, and in terms of like writing a paragraph about why Democrats and Republicans might think about poor people differently, and instead getting to measuring how Democrats and Republicans report that they feel about poor people, so that we can then make a more precise comparison. In this case, we can then create this expectation or this written hypothesis that says something like this final bullet point: evaluation of poor people among Democrats will be more positive or greater than the evaluation of poor people among Republicans. Now, when we're thinking about hypotheses like these, when we're talking about two independent variables, just a couple of simple categories we're trying to compare, there are only a few logical options available to us. And it's important for us to think through these logical options, because what it enables us to do is to then rigorously set up some contrasts and comparisons that we can make. So we can make then this hypothesis from the previous page. It says Democrats will evaluate the poor higher than Republicans will. Again, this is a hypothesis, right? We're evaluating the truth claim about what we're saying here. We can then reduce that to the math sentence version of our hypothesis. Another logical option is that Democrats will evaluate the poor lower than Republicans will. And we can convert that into a math sentence. And then finally, we can create our null hypothesis by saying that Democrats will evaluate the poor exactly the same level as Republicans will. And we can convert that to a math sentence. Notice that when we're comparing these two groups and we're talking about this measure, these are literally the only three options that are available to us. When we find a measurement of evaluation and we're comparing these two groups, one of these three math sentences will be true, and supported by the data, and the others will not be true. So this is a way of our simplifying our expectations so that our data analysis has a specific standard that we can use to evaluate the truthfulness of the claims. Now, of course, when we're talking about party identification, we could talk about other political parties. We could talk about the Green Party or the Socialist Workers' Party, or we could talk about the Working Families Party or the Libertarians. We could apply it to independents and so forth. For our example, we're just going to keep it simple and compare Democrats and Republicans. Finally, for the purposes of thinking rigorously and carefully about our quantitative analysis in this process, is that we have to remember that when we eventually look at our data, that only one of these three statements can be true, and by true I mean supported by the data at any given time. So if hypothesis 1 is true, that we accept it, then hypotheses 2 and the null hypothesis are rejected. If hypothesis 2 turns out to be true, then we accept that, even though it seemed counterintuitive to us on the front end, and we reject hypothesis 1 and the null hypothesis. And then third, if the null hypothesis is accepted, that is, we find out that Democrats and Republicans are equal in their evaluation of the poor, then we reject our other two hypotheses. This is a really kind of critical way of understanding what we're doing with our hypothesis testing. So now let's think about what this looks like in terms of a data analysis. Our theory is party identification somehow shapes people's perceptions of social and political groups. We think, for example, that we look at the way the Democrats portray themselves, and we think about the bumper sticker, Democrats serve the people. We think about the way that Democratic candidates talk about poor people, and they often seem extremely sympathetic, and sometimes Republicans don't. So we might then say, this is our theory, this is the basis of our theory, we have this hypothesis. But then we have the question about how we're actually going to measure Democrats and Republicans' attitudes toward poor people. Well, in social science, and increasingly in professional political polling, a really common measuring stick that we use is something called the feeling thermometer. With a feeling thermometer, people are asked to evaluate groups or evaluate individuals or evaluate political persons or institutions. With this tool, we say, how do you feel about this? If you have a very warm or positive feeling, then you would score 100 on our feeling thermometer. If you feel very negative about this person or this group, then you would score them at a 0. And then if you're completely neutral, you have neither positive nor negative feelings toward this group, then you would score at a 50. And so people are shown this feeling thermometer, or they're told about it, and then they're usually given a bunch of different groups to evaluate. Well, in one set of surveys called the American National Election Studies, this was done in over many years, and one of the peak groups that gets evaluated are poor people. This measure, as we think about the characteristics of variables, produces what we consider to be an interval or ratio level variable. So in that case, we think about what's the appropriate measures of central tendency and dispersion for describing a dependent variable like this. And for central tendency, we think about the median and the mean. The median is, in a group, what is the middle person saying? What is the position of the middle person? With the mean, we calculate the average of all the people we talk to, and we calculate what that average is. Well, since we're focused primarily on means for reasons we talked about in a previous session, we're going to then slightly adjust or clarify our hypotheses to refer not just to a generic evaluation, but we're going to be specific about saying the mean evaluation of Democrats, we hypothesize, will be higher than the mean evaluation of Republicans. So we then end up with these three very brief math sentences in which the mean of Democrats is greater than the mean of Republicans, the mean of Democrats is less than the mean of Republicans, or that the mean of Democrats will be equal to the mean of Republicans. That's our null hypothesis. Now, if you're in my class, I've given you inside the presentation here, I've shown you how to get this out of SPSS, how to generate these kinds of outputs from SPSS. For our purposes here, I want to look at two tables that are generated by SPSS to help us test our hypothesis. First of all, whenever we're looking at a variable, we want to look at how all respondents respond to our variable. There are several ways that we can do this. In this case, we're just interested in looking at the measures of central tendency and dispersion for our interval ratio level feeling thermometer on poor people. Now, as we look through this, table, we can see a couple of things. First of all, we've got 3,595 people who answered the question. 54 people, for some reason, are missing from the answers to this question. The mean of the overall group is 73. So on a scale of 0 to 100 on our feeling thermometer, the average person in our overall sample evaluated poor people at 73. The median is 70. What that means is if we could line up all those 3,595 people in a row, the exact middle person evaluated poor people at 70. And then finally, we look at the standard deviation, and the standard deviation tells us, on average, how much difference is there between the mean and the typical person. So we would then say the typical person evaluates poor people at 73 out of 100, and the typical person deviates from that by 20 points. Now, we want to compare our groups by party identification. So we have another variable that's pretty normal, and we measure then how individuals report themselves as being Democrats, Republicans, Independents, or something else. Again, for our purposes in this example, we're only interested in Democrats and Republicans. We're going to compare the relevant measures of central tendency, the mean and the median, and then we're going to be able to evaluate our hypotheses to determine which one of these three statements turns out to be supported by the data. Here's the table that gets generated by SPSS when we ask it to compare party identification with evaluations of poor people on the feeling thermometer. The way that this is organized is that you have here on the rows the three categories of party identifiers: Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. And then across the columns here, we have a set of specific statistics that I requested when I generated the output. I asked SPSS to show me the median and the mean and the standard deviation and the number of cases for each of these three groups. With this information, then we can compare the groups, Democrats and Republicans here, who we're interested in, and we can evaluate then which one of our hypotheses turns out to be true. So we're going to compare the median and the mean. First, when we look at the median, we can see that the median Democrat evaluates, if we could line up all the Democrats, we got 1,271 Democrats, we see that over here, that if we could line up 1,271 Democrats across the stage, the exact middle Democrat evaluates poor people at 83. When we look at Republicans, the exact middle Republican, we have 998 of them. The exact middle Republican evaluates poor people at a 70 on our 100-point scale. Now we look at the mean, and we see here that the average Democrat evaluates the poor people at 77.42 on our 100-point scale. And the average Republican evaluates poor people at 70.55 points on our 100-point feeling thermometer. So our process then is extremely simple, right? All we have to do is compare the numbers, and we can evaluate these hypotheses. And as it turns out, we can accept the first hypothesis. Our intuition was right, that Democrats, on balance, feel more positively about poor people than Republicans do. The mean for Democrats is greater than the mean for Republicans. This is supported for the data. The other two alternatives, Democrats less than Republicans and Democrats equal to the Republicans, are not supported by the data, so we reject them. Just for future reference, we want to make sure that we point out that here we are rejecting the null hypothesis. But this is not all the comparison that we can draw. We can also compare the standard deviations, but let's look at the logic of that. This is actually a way about developing hypotheses about the internal diversity of groups that we're interested in studying. So again, if we work off of our theory that in-party identification shapes perceptions of social, political, and economic groups, we might come up with a hypothesis that says not only are Democrats more positively disposed toward poor people than Republicans are, but we think that Democrats are more uniform in their evaluations of poor people. That is, that they think alike, whereas Republicans' views might be more widely varied than Democrats will be. And we might have some theory as to why we would expect that to be. Well, we can measure this diversity through our measures of variation and dispersion. For interval or ratio level variables, we're primarily interested at the standard deviation, though there are other measures we can look at, such as the range and the variance. In this case, standard deviation is what we're going to focus on. We then develop a hypothesis that's more specific and mathematical looking. It says that evaluation diversity among Democrats will be less than evaluation diversity among Republicans. And our three math sentences would look like this. Standard deviation for Democrats is less than the standard deviation for Republicans. Remember, standard deviation is a way of evaluating internal diversity. The more diversity, the larger your standard deviation will be. The less diversity you have, the smaller your standard deviation will be. So we have the hypothesis that we think is likely to be true based on, for some reason. We have an alternative hypothesis that Democrats' standard deviation will be greater than the standard deviation of Republicans. What that means is that it's possible that Democrats will be more varied, less uniform than Republicans are in their evaluation of poor people. And then, of course, we have our null hypothesis that says that Democrats and Republicans are equally diverse when it comes to their attitudes to the poor. Let's go ahead and go back to the slides that we had, the output that we had a moment ago, and we'll evaluate these hypotheses. Here we're looking at the same outputs. We have our statistics output. We can see the standard deviation for all respondents is 20.087. Then we can look at party identification. We're going to divide our output by party ID, and we're going to then compare the relevant measures of dispersion. In this case, our standard deviation, and we'll be able to evaluate our hypotheses. In this case, we see the Democrats have a standard deviation of 18.66, and Republicans have a standard deviation of 20.62. Now, let's take a moment and just see what those statistics overall tell us. Let's use the mean and the standard deviation to describe Democrats for a second. The average Democrat evaluates poor people at 77.42, but not all Democrats do that. On average, Democrats vary or differ from that mean by 18.66 points. We can do the same thing for Republicans. The average Republican evaluates poor people at 70.55, but the average Republican deviates from that by 20.62 points. So we here then get a sense that on balance, yes, Democrats do evaluate the poor people higher, and Republicans evaluate them a little bit lower. But look, the Republican evaluation is not negative, right? It's substantially better than neutral, which is 50. Then we can look at the internal composition of these groups. How diverse are they? Democrats vary a lot, but their variation is smaller. Their standard deviation is smaller than that of Republicans by about 2 points. So all things being equal, the typical Democrat is going to be around 77.42, but the typical Democrat will deviate from that. But the typical Republican will deviate more from their mean than the Democrats will. So as a group then, Democrats have this kind of evaluation of poor people, and they are more uniform. We evaluate our hypotheses. We accept the hypothesis that we had. The standard deviation for Democrats is less than the standard deviation of Republicans. We reject the other two hypotheses, including our null hypothesis. And so we then have the ability to evaluate this interval ratio level variable using a categorical variable simply by comparing the means and the standard deviations.